Rockaways Productions presents The Casey Waters Show, episode 240. Autistic satisfaction. Hello, I'm your host, Casey Waters. Today, I will continue with resource management. Here, I look at the management of forestry resources. Last show, I miscalculated how much material I had with hiking adventure, climate change, and resource management. Even though I said I would have time for all autistic satisfaction, I never made it there. Well, the good news is today's program I will have time. So, with just a little bit of resource management left, where I'll talk about managing forest resources, well then it is all autistic satisfaction. Here I look at my personal history of marginal autism and how autistic people can have satisfaction, at least how I did, and why, and how normal people can interact with autistic people better by understanding them more completely. Sure, autistic people are complicated, and, well, everyone's different. You just have to get to know them. Then it's on to the answer to the question. Here I look at the eastside imaginary territory of thought and what it would be like if it became dominant and widely accepted. The eastside imaginary territory of thought emphasizes truth, compassion, and free access to knowledge and power for all. The East Side does not like deception anyway. So, this program will feature background footage from the airplane ride from Key West to Dry Tortugas. Here, I flew in a de Havilland DHC Otter aircraft from about, I think it was built in 1957. It was a lot of fun, and that's how I derive some of my autistic satisfaction. I was seated behind the pilot, and so I was able to watch what he was doing. Well, I was seated behind the co-pilot, rather, and I could see across to the pilot and see what he was doing. There was a lever next to his seat. Well, I think he used it to control the height of the wheel against the float. I guess that's my guess. I came up with that this afternoon. Well, anyway, so also there'll be some background footage from World's Edge. I hiked there recently, where I had views toward South Carolina and views of Lake Lure as I walked along a ridge. So, now let's continue with resource management. And this mud gets into streams and affects wildlife. What needs to happen is trees should be cut down, well, sporadically, perhaps one out of every 20 trees removed, and thus there'll be less damage to the land. Sure, it's a little less efficient and more labor intensive, but we get less erosion out of it. And by leaving some trees behind, you get more biodiversity and more trees for the future. For that is what is important, having more forest, more biodiversity, and less monoculture. That is, one crop grown over a large area. We need smaller plots in agriculture, interspersed by wild areas where wild grasses and bushes are allowed to grow. Once again, this might be less efficient and produce less food, but it will help our planet more. We need to get our agricultural practices in gear and our food distribution systems in gear so less food is wasted and more food goes to where it's needed. And if we could have less food wasted, perhaps we could produce less food. And if we could produce less food, we could have less of an impact on the land. Keep in mind, large quantities of food are wasted. Well, because that's just the way things work. Sometimes there's not enough help to harvest the crops when it is time to harvest them. Sometimes other things can create waste, such as storms and whatnot. Sometimes waste is created because, well, of excess harvest, and there's just simply too much of a bumper crop, and hence some of it is just wasted in piles that just rot away, or perhaps even dumped into the ocean. Well, I remember it's from one of the Moody Blues songs, I guess in the late 60s or early 70s. I forgot the name of the song. I remember one of the lines, though. And it goes like this. While a frightened and starving world fills the sea with grain. Unfortunately, it's true. Grain is wasted that way because the distribution systems are not in place. Well, we need to change all that and make sure everyone is taken care of and make sure that our resources are managed better. I hope you have enjoyed this section of the Casey Waters Show. Now it is time for all autistic satisfaction. Well, what is anyway? Well, is a process. Well, I guess more specifically an activity. Something I do. You do Well, at least I As I said, it's something I do. Well, what is it? Well, I used to do it much more and much better when I was younger, when I was more under the influence of my marginal autism. So, here's what happens. I find a quiet spot where I'm not interacting with people. Then, perhaps I would pick up a stick, or maybe a string, or a piece of plastic railroad track, or something like that. And I would shake it in front of me, and I would make funny noises, hissing noises, like something like that. Anyway, it all depends what you're oohing about. See, really opens up the world of imagination. See, what happens is I shut down perception of what's around me. I don't really hear or see what's around me. And I guess the visual perception might be even affected more. But I would still see a little bit of what's around me and hear. So thus, if someone approached me or talked to me, they would often rapidly bring me out of the ooh state, and I would pay attention to them, and it would instantly end. However, when you're in the ooh state, well, when you're doing ooh, as I said, you don't really see much what's around you. Your visual and hearing sensations are partially shut down, but they are replaced by what you're thinking about, by your imagination. So you have a keen, strong sense of imagination where you can intensely visualize or feel or empathize with a situation. You can really relate to it, in other words. Sure. So what was I relating to when I could do it so well, when I was so young? Well, circa 4 or 5 years old, I guess my oldest memories are exit ramps. I guess I wanted to be a civil engineer and design exit ramps in the future. I would visualize the angle needed for a cloverleaf exit ramp and how a cloverleaf intersection might be like, and other types of interstate highway intersections. But what else is good to ooh about? Well, certainly planes taking off and landing is a lot of fun to ooh about. Things that move are fun to ooh about. So, also perhaps intense situations where you have intense emotions. That might be appropriate to ooh about too, I guess. And of course, good music always helps. Set the mood and perhaps set the ooh. Sure, or set the ooh in motion or affect the type of ooh. I'm sure this varies probably considerably amongst autistic people. This is just my aspect, how what happens to me, and how I feel my autism the strongest. I feel is through this ooh process. It's where it comes out the most, I feel. Is it beneficial? I feel it is. I guess that's why I still retained it and didn't try to suppress it all. Sure, I do it a lot less now that I'm an adult, but still, it's fun to do, and still, I'll do it, and perhaps even do it in public. But now, it's much more subtle. Perhaps I'll just move my hands a little bit like this, or something like that. I don't really do it near at the intensity that I did it when I was much younger, when the vision was much clearer, but I could still do it fairly well, especially if I really feel I have the right concentration and I'm all alone. Am I bold enough to ooh on camera? No, unfortunately not. So I guess you can't quite witness it. As I said, it's kind of a private thing, something I would prefer to do by myself, if I could pull it off that way. Of course, when I was younger, I did do it in public, like at recess, let's say, or around my family, and thus I would be interrupted. Sure, and even occasionally bullied around first and second grade. But that wore off as I integrated into the classroom and social situation more strongly when I was around third grade. Then the teacher, instead of saying, everybody, pick up your pen and paper and start drawing, and I wouldn't respond, so the teacher would have to come to me when my autism was stronger in first and second grade. But then, by third grade, when the teacher said everyone pick up their pencil and paper and draw, I would follow the instructions. Anyway, so this is all very interesting. Of course, who I am boils down to my personal history, I guess like it does with everybody. Sure. So, lucky me. When I was young, I guess around 3 years old or so, maybe even, I guess really around age 2 onward, um, my mom figured out with the aid of her doctor that I was autistic. So I saw a fine doctor at Columbian Presbyterian University in New York City who specialized in autism. This would have been around, let's say, 1964 or so. The doctor advised my mom to have me interact with my family more, and she did so accordingly, and interact with me one to one every day. And so she would spend an hour or so teaching me every day. She would teach me, well, whatever I could absorb: shapes, colors, what different vehicles were: school bus versus trucks versus cars, counting ABCs, and so on. So it was like preschool, I guess, at home with my mom, and by teaching me interacting with me one on one, and giving me great advice, of course, and through my own experiences of growing up in a large family, who my mom encouraged my siblings to interact with me, this all minimized my autism, or at least I feel it did. Of course, I was still allowed to have my autistic satisfaction, and thus a balance was reached. For instance, autistic people love to be the center of attention, and often I would clamor for it. Sure, of course, it's tough when you have a brother and 4 sisters. But anyway, so this is how it went. And I was fifth as far as age order. I was the second to the youngest. So I would clamor for attention, and sometimes I would get it. Occasional lucky breaks which would come my way. Perhaps the most distinguished one that I remember the most is my mom had her babysitter Christine, and she would visit us. So Christine and her boyfriend, I forgot his name, they took me to New Hampshire when I was around 8 years old or so. That is just me, not me and some of my siblings or the rest of the family, but just me. And so I had all the attention. It was a lot of fun. I remember flying a kite and it getting ever higher and higher. It got so high up in the air that I ran out of string. I wanted to pull it down, but they said we didn't have enough time and it was time to go. I had to let the kite fly, and off it went. But anyway, so that's autism in my history in a large family. So that's fine. But I guess it's different with every family, of course. And it is important to strike a balance between interaction and having some alone time to do what you want to do, to or whatever. Autistic people often become very focused on something or several things. They have real empathy. Remember, they could really visualize clearly and relate to things well. It might not seem obvious, of course, I guess especially with more severe autism. Remember, I'm only marginally autistic, and I largely pulled out of it, being a little worse, I guess, when I was younger, when I oohed more. But anyway, so, what about an only child? Well, I only can speculate here. I'm assuming it would be good if you had an autistic only child to have that child interact with other children, normal children and autistic children, whatever the child wanted, at least to a point. Of course, you can't get away with everything. And so I guess it's important to strike a balance where the child learns to give in to the demands of the family or school or other situations that the child might not want to deal with. He or she might abhor certain social situations, but these might be essential for development, such as school. So, whatever the case, social interaction of some sort, I guess even if the child is homeschooled, I guess they should have friends or other people to interact with to help them get along more with society and adjust to being in society. So it's a matter of striking a balance. I guess that's what my mom taught me. You can't always get your way. You have to give in and be a part of society and do what they want most of the time. But gee, you should get your autistic satisfaction too occasionally, and hence the title of the show. All ooh, autistic satisfaction. You should be able to totally get into it and totally ooh on it. I guess with me, on my recent trip to Key West, I went to Dry Tortugas. Here, even though I was the last person on the plane, which held about 15 people, I got the best seat. I was right behind the pilot and the co-pilot. And more specifically, I was behind the co-pilot so I could see what the pilot was doing. So I watched the pilot take off, watch him pulling back on the wheel as the plane ascended. This was a 1957 de Havilland DHC Otter aircraft we flew in. It's a single engine float plane with wheels. So it was able to take off from Key West Airport and land on the water near Dry Tortugas. The plane backed into the beach and we were able to step off, right off the skid, directly onto the beach. Anyway, so what's so great about it? Well, gee, as I said, planes are something great to ooh about. And sure, when you're watching the pilot, especially flying such an unusual plane, there was a handle that came up from the base of the seat. It was probably a couple feet long. It was a straight handle. The pilot would pump it occasionally, even before takeoff. I'm not sure what it did. I didn't ask him. I didn't want to distract him, so I just watched. There was a wheel he turned at the base of his seat, where the back of the seat and the base of the seat met. You think it would have been adjustment for the seat, but I suspect it was for something else. Once again, I don't know, but just watching him turn the wheel and pump the handle, amongst other things, such as working the throttle, gave me a real sense of being the pilot and being able to fly the plane and being able to know how the plane was being flown. All of this is great for autistic satisfaction, as it helps me relate to the situation of flying the plane, something moving. Of course, every autistic person has things they like to ooh about, I guess, or like to do. So it's just a matter of giving them that time to really be able to do what they want, to have their autistic satisfaction. Every autistic person is different, and so it's important to communicate with him or her and try to understand their situation and find ways to help them to be satisfied. For when you really have autistic satisfaction, I mean it's true satisfaction, you really enjoy yourself. But anyway, so it's important to be able to communicate with autistic people and help them adjust to living in society and giving them a little autistic satisfaction. Now it is time for the answer to the question. Here I look at the imaginary territories and, well, what it would be like if the eastside imaginary territory became dominant. What changes there would be? Well, so here we go. How do you know when the east side becomes dominant? Well, first of all, the east side imaginary territory of thought, this idea of mine I created way back when I was 14 years old. Well, the east side imaginary territory of thought favors honesty. When they look for someone to be their life partner, they typically look at their personality instead of their appearance. They don't place a lot of emphasis on how much money they make. It's more about, do they enjoy hanging out with them and do they share similar values? The east side, as I said, favors honesty. They typically like cooperation and they don't like deception. The west side allows deception and uses it often to advance one's personal gains. For instance, a west side person would deceive coworkers in order to secure a promotion, where an east side person would think that was just horrible to do something like that. A west side person would seek someone who looks nice and someone who makes a lot of money to be their life partner, even though they might not like their personalities and values much. Well, anyway, that's how it goes. Usually the east side can be recognized because they hate deception, and the west side can be recognized because deception is permitted. They don't brag about it, but you'll just see that it's permitted and notice it. Well, if you're perceptive. But anyway, so the west side is deceptive, but the east side isn't. So, how do you know when the east side becomes dominant? What's the answer to the question? Well, the answer is kind of interesting. For the west side might like you to think the east side became dominant, and there might be deceptive ways of doing this. But when the east side really becomes dominant, and it's the real east side, the largest imaginary territory, the most popular one, well, you'll know. Here's how. Because suddenly you'll be told, even if you can't understand the concepts, you will be educated until you can understand that you, regardless of your age or intellectual capability, can check for deception. Casey Waters Show. Producer, Casey Waters. Graphic editing, Judson Laird. Please note our new email address, caseywaters2@caseywaters.com.